Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, let us drift back through thousands of years to the golden sands of ancient Egypt, a land of river breezes, hidden chambers, and the delicate art of perfumery. In this story, you will discover how the Egyptians transformed petals and resins into scents that could soothe the mind and awaken the spirit. Close your eyes, settle into comfort, and allow each chapter to guide you into a gentle, fragrant journey through time. Neferet slipped from her sleeping mat and wrapped herself in a linen shawl, woven so fine it felt like river mist. She stepped across the cool tiles, each marked with painted lotus flowers, and entered the workroom where her mother prepared the first batch of kaifi. It was a fragrance the Egyptians believed could soften the air, quiet restless thoughts, and bring the sleeper closer to the divine. Kaifi was no simple recipe. It was a slow marriage of ingredients, resins from far deserts, sweet honey, fragrant spices, and bunches of wild herbs gathered at night when their oils were most potent. Tia believed that each ingredient held a story, and that a perfume was a kind of memory, pressed into oil and smoke. This morning, Neferet watched as her mother unwrapped a bundle of myrrh. The resin gleamed like amber in the lamplight. With a bronze blade, Tia shaved thin curls into a clay bowl. She worked without hurry, her movements as deliberate as a priestess preparing for ritual. When she was satisfied, she added crushed juniper berries and a pinch of cinnamon, then set the mixture aside to warm gently over coals. "Breathe in," Tia whispered. Neferet closed her eyes. The scent rose to meet her. Warm, dark, and strangely comforting. Even before she learned the words for each aroma, she had known their power to soothe. Beyond the courtyard wall, the city of Waset stirred to life. Merchants called to one another as they arranged bolts of dyed linen. Fishermen dragged nets still dripping from the river. And somewhere in the tangle of streets, a procession of priests prepared to carry sacred oil into the temple of Amun. Neferet liked to imagine that their family's kaifi would find its way there, that its smoke might curl around the statue of the god and mingle with the morning prayers. But for now, it was enough to stand beside her mother and learn. Tia lifted a small jar of lotus oil and removed the lid. The scent was bright and almost sweet, a memory of still ponds where blue petals floated like little boats. She poured a few drops over the warming mixture. The fragrance shifted, no longer sharp, but soft and round. "Every scent must have balance," she said. "One note to lift the spirit, another to ground it." Neferet nodded, though she still found it difficult to imagine how something so delicate could shape a person's mood. Her mother always said that perfume was a kind of unseen architecture. You could not see its walls, but you felt them enclosing you, holding you safe. As the sky brightened, Tia moved to the marble slab where the last of the summer's rose petals lay drying. Their color had faded to pale ivory, but their fragrance remained. With a gentle hand, she gathered them into a linen sachet. "These will be crushed and added to the base," she explained, "but only at the end, when the heat has passed. Roses are shy. They lose themselves if pressed too soon." Neferet thought of all the things she had learned in the months since her first morning in the perfumery. How to weigh spices on tiny copper scales, how to watch for the first wisp of steam rising from an infusion, how to seal an amphora with clay and a strip of linen so that no air could spoil the oil within. Each step seems small, but together they form something lasting. When the first customers arrived, a woman with braided hair, a scribe in a plain tunic, a young mother with a baby slung against her hip, Tia greeted each by name. Some came to purchase a cone of perfumed wax to melt in the evening's heat. Others sought a vial of sacred oil for rituals or healing. Neferet watched closely as her mother measured out each portion, pressing a seal into the soft clay stopper to mark their family's sign, a lotus blossom in relief. The morning passed in a hush of careful work. Now and then, Neferet carried a basket of spent petals to the garden where she scattered them among the papyrus reeds. By midday, the air was warm enough that the scent of the fresh kerfi drifted over the courtyard wall, mingling with the smell of baking bread and river mud. When their work was done, Tia and Neferet sat together in the shade of the date palm. Tia unwrapped a piece of honeyed cake and broke it in two, handing one half to her daughter. "Why do people love perfume so much?" Neferet asked, her voice quiet. Tia smiled. "Because it reminds them of what they cannot hold. Summer, blossoms, the memory of a moment that passed too quickly." Neferet thought about that as she tasted the sweetness on her tongue. She imagined a time far in the future when someone would open an old jar of kerfi and feel a memory stir, though they did not know whose hands had made it. In that moment, as the river breeze stirred the garden leaves, she understood what her mother meant, that the art of perfume was not only to preserve a scent, but to shape a feeling that might outlast the life of any single flower. The sun climbed higher, painting the courtyard in pale gold. Neferet rested her head against her mother's shoulder, and together they watched the last wisps of morning incense fade into the bright sky. Chapter 2. The Garden of Aromatics. When dawn came the next morning, Neferet woke to the same gentle hush that seemed to settle over their perfumery before the city stirred. The walls still held the cool of the night. As she sat up, she heard her mother's footsteps crossing the courtyard, soft as drifting petals. Today, they would walk beyond the house to gather herbs for the next batch of oils. Tia had promised to take Neferet to the Garden of Aromatics, a place she had heard of all her life but never seen. It lay behind high walls near the temple quarter, where priests and perfumers tended rare plants said to have grown first in the gardens of the gods. Neferet dressed quickly and tied her hair back with a strip of linen. She followed her mother through the narrow passage that led to the street. Already the air was warming, scented with bread baking in clay ovens and the faint tang of river mud. They passed rows of houses painted with faded ochre murals, lotus blossoms, reeds, curling vines. Neferet liked to trace the outlines with her eyes as they walked, imagining that the painted plants might one day bloom for real. At last they came to a tall wooden gate, reinforced with bronze studs. A priest in a white linen kilt emerged to greet them. Tia offered a small bundle of dried myrrh, an offering in thanks for the privilege of entry. The priest accepted it with a nod and swung the gate wide. Inside, the Garden of Aromatics was unlike anything Neferet had known. Sunlight fell in wide shafts across raised beds bordered with glazed tiles. The air shimmered with warmth and the layered scent of countless leaves and blossoms. Along each path grew plants she recognized only from the little clay jars in their perfumery. Green sprigs of marjoram, pale clusters of henna flowers, and tall stalks of sweet flag. At the center of the garden rose a shallow pool edged with white stone. Lotus blossoms floated in its still water, their petals just beginning to open in the morning heat. Neferet felt her breath catch in her throat. She had never realized how blue a lotus could be, like a piece of the sky had fallen and settled among the reeds. Her mother touched her shoulder. "The plants here are tended with more care than any royal treasure," she said. "Each leaf is gathered at the proper hour. Each flower is picked before the sun grows too fierce. That is how the scents stay true." They spent the morning moving slowly from bed to bed. Tia showed her how to choose only the youngest shoots, which held the purest oils. Neferet learned to look closely at each leaf, to see whether it glistened with dew or had begun to droop. When they reached the patch of marjoram, her mother knelt and showed her how to pinch the stems without bruising them. The fragrance rose at once, sharp, clean, alive. Neferet closed her eyes and breathed in, imagining the way this scent would blend with others in the copper cauldron at home. Nearby, another woman worked among the plants, imagining the way this scent would blend with others in the copper cauldron at home. Nearby, another woman worked among the plants, gathering henna blossoms into a basket. She looked up and smiled. "Is this your daughter?" she asked Tia.
"Yes," Tia said, pride softening her voice. "She will carry this work after me." The woman nodded, her eyes kind. "Then she will come to know how a garden teaches patience." Neferet felt a quiet thrill in her chest. All her life she had watched her mother work, learning the names of spices and oils. But today, among these growing things, she understood that a perfume's story began long before it ever reached their clay jars. As the sun climbed higher, they finished their gathering. Tia wrapped the bundles of herbs in damp cloth so they would not wither before they reached home. Neferet lingered by the lotus pool, watching bees drift among the blossoms. For a moment, she wished she could stay there all day, breathing the mingled scents and feeling the warmth on her skin. But Tia called gently, and Neferet turned to follow. They stepped back into the street, the garden gate swinging shut behind them. Even outside, the memory of that place seemed to cling to her, like the perfume of henna on her palms. On their walk home, Tia spoke softly about the origins of each plant. She explained how the first perfumers had learned to press oils from petals, how the priests had refined those methods into sacred rituals. In the days of the earliest pharaohs, she said, perfumes were as precious as gold, carried in carved alabaster flasks and sealed with wax to keep their power intact. Neferet listened, imagining those ancient hands, steady and reverent, as they measured out each ingredient. She wondered if the women who had tended the first gardens felt the same quiet pride she felt now. When they reached their perfumery, the air inside was cool and still. Neferet laid out the bundles on the marble slab, arranging them by type. She noticed how the colors seemed to glow in the dim room, the pale green of sweet flag, the bright clusters of marjoram, the creamy petals of henna. Her mother looked over her shoulder. "Tomorrow, we will begin to crush them," she said, "but today, we let them rest." Nefer nodded, feeling the hush of the garden still in her mind. As she washed her hands in the basin by the door, she thought how much there was still to learn. But she also felt, for the first time, that she belonged to this work, not just as an apprentice, but as a keeper of something ancient and quietly beautiful. And when night came, she lay on her mat, the scent of fresh herbs rising around her like a promise. In her dreams, she walked again among the lotus pools, the blossoms opening one by one in the golden light. Chapter 3. The Copper Cauldron. Morning in the perfumery began with the soft clang of bronze vessels. Nefer rose when the first gleam of light touched the courtyard tiles, feeling a hush that belonged only to these earliest hours. Today, they would begin the most delicate step, warming the herbs and blending them with oil in the copper cauldron that had been in her family longer than anyone could remember. The cauldron itself sat upon a low brick hearth at the back of the workroom. Its surface was polished smooth by generations of hands, its rounded belly marked with faint dents that seemed to tell stories of all the fragrances it had held. Nefer had watched her mother use it many times, but this morning Tia placed her palm on the rim and looked at her daughter with solemn eyes. "Today," she said, "you will stir the first infusion." Nefer's breath caught in her throat. She had crushed petals, measured resins, even shaped the cooling wax into perfumed cones. But never before had she been trusted to stir the cauldron itself. She felt the weight of it like a hush in her chest. Tia showed her how to lay a handful of dried marjoram into the vessel, followed by pale petals of henna and the sprigs of sweet flag. Each was arranged with care, never tossed in haste. Then she poured a stream of clear oil, pressed from the ripest olives, until it rose halfway up the mound of herbs. The oil glistened, catching the lamplight in shifting golden ripples. Nefer rested her hand on the wooden paddle. The smooth handle felt cool against her palm. Her mother placed her hand over Nefer's for a moment, as though passing something invisible. Then she stepped back. "When you stir," Tia said, "think of nothing else. Let your breath match the motion. Let your thoughts become as quiet as the oil itself." Slowly, Nefret began to move the paddle. The herbs swirled beneath the surface, releasing a faint fragrance that grew stronger as the warmth crept in. The scent rose, fresh and green at first, then deeper, like the earth after rain. She felt her shoulders ease, her heartbeat slow. Outside, the city began to wake. Donkeys brayed as they were loaded with baskets. A vendor called out the price of honey cakes. But in the perfumery, there was only the cauldron and the two of them. The hush, unbroken. Tia knelt beside a clay jar and measured out powdered frankincense. She did not add it yet, only set it near the hearth, ready for the moment when the infusion reached its fullest bloom. Nefret could not say how she knew when that moment arrived, but she felt it as surely as she felt the warmth in her hands. The scent had become something round and whole, no longer separate notes but a single presence. Tia nodded once. With careful fingers, she sprinkled the frankincense into the oil. The change was immediate, a bright sweetness unfurling in the air.
Nefret almost felt she could see it, a pale wisp rising from the surface of the cauldron like a spirit. For a time, neither spoke. They worked as if in ritual, measuring, stirring, lifting the paddle to check the thickness of the oil. Each step had been written centuries before, when the first perfumers recorded their secrets on papyrus scrolls. Tia kept one of those scrolls in a lacquered chest, its edges dark with age. Though Nefret could not yet read the old script, she knew the shapes of the glyphs, lotus, honey, flame, and felt their meaning like a promise. As the morning light grew stronger, Tia set the paddle aside. With a broad ladle, she lifted the infusion into small clay jars lined in a neat row. Each was stoppered with linen and sealed with a dab of soft clay pressed with their family's mark. When the last jar was filled, she looked at Nefret and smiled. "You have done well," she said. "The oil is clean and true. This will keep its fragrance long after the blossoms have faded." Nefret felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the hearth. She thought of the old cauldron, how many hands had stirred it, how many years it had waited in this room for each new harvest. She wondered if one day her own daughter would stand here, feeling the same hush, the same belonging. Before the sun reached its highest point, Tia prepared 2 small jars of the fresh infusion as gifts. One would go to the temple of Hathor, goddess of love and fragrance. The other would be given to a midwife who had aided their family in the past. Nefret held the offering meant for the temple, feeling the clay warm against her skin. She tried to imagine the priests lifting the jar to the altar, the scent rising in slow spirals to please a presence she could not see. At midday, when the heat pressed against the walls like a hand, they closed the shutters and rested. Nefret lay on her mat, her body tired but light, as though the quiet labor had smoothed away every worry. The fragrance clung to her hair, her skin, her dreams, and when she drifted into sleep, she dreamed of the cauldron still stirring itself, the oil swirling in endless circles, the fragrance never fading, only becoming more itself with each turn. Chapter 4. The Temple Offering. The following morning the air was cool and still, as if the city itself paused to listen. Nefret rose before the light touched the garden wall. She dressed in her plain linen tunic and tied her hair back in a single plait. Beside her sleeping mat, the small jar of perfumed oil waited, sealed and marked with the family's sign. Today she would carry it to the temple of Hathor. Her mother had explained that the offering was more than a gift. It was a gesture of gratitude, a way to honor the goddess who watched over music, love, and sweet fragrance. It was said that no perfume truly reached its fullest power until it had been laid at Hathor's feet. Nefret held the jar close as they stepped into the quiet street. The dawn light turned the mud brick walls to gold. In the distance, she could see the pylons of the temple rising against the sky, carved with scenes of gods and kings. The nearer they drew, the more she felt a hush grow inside her, as though she carried something far older than any memory. The courtyard of the temple was wide and shaded by rows of columns, painted in colors that still glowed after centuries: deep blue, red ochre, bright green. Priests moved among the shadows, their linen robes stirring softly. When Tia approached one of them, the man inclined his head and led them along the pillared walkway to the inner chamber. Nefret had never been inside the sanctuary. The air there was cool, touched by the faint scent of lotus and old incense. A tall statue of Hathor rose at the far end, carved in polished stone, so smooth it almost reflected her face. The goddess wore a crown shaped like cow's horns, cradling the sun disk, and her expression was gentle, as though she looked upon every visitor with patient curiosity. Her mother knelt and placed the offering on a low altar. Nefret did the same, setting the little jar carefully beside the larger one. The priest murmured a blessing in a voice that sounded older than any she had heard before. Though she could not follow every word, she recognized the rhythm, a chant passed unchanged through generations. For a moment, Nefret closed her eyes. She felt the hush of the chamber, the cool stone beneath her knees, the faint sweetness of the oil rising like a memory. In that stillness, she wondered whether the goddess truly felt gratitude for such gifts, or whether the act of giving itself was enough to transform a simple jar of oil into something sacred. When the blessing was finished, the priest gestured for them to rise. Tia bowed once more, then turned toward the door. Nefret hesitated, studying the face of Hathor. In the soft light, the stone eyes seemed almost alive. She felt a curious warmth, as though some unseen presence watched her with quiet approval. Outside, the city was already awake. Merchants spread their wares. Heaps of dates and barley, baskets of dyed thread, copper amulets shaped like ankhs and scarabs. The air shimmered with the smell of bread baking in clay ovens. But Nefret carried with her a deeper stillness, the hush of the sanctuary lingering in her thoughts. As they walked home, she asked her mother why perfumes were always offered to the gods. Tia thought for a moment before answering. Because perfume is what remains after everything else is gone, she said. Food spoils, flowers wither. Even the finest linen will turn to dust. But a scent, if it is made true, can outlast all of that. It becomes a memory the gods can keep. Nefret felt her chest tighten, not with sadness, but with wonder. She imagined the fragrance of their kaifi, rising in slow curls to mingle with the incense of other offerings. Perhaps in some way she could not see, those invisible threads bound their small household to the great temples and the spirits that watched over them. When they reached home, Nefret placed her hands on the smooth threshold stone, as if grounding herself back in the familiar space. The perfumery was warm with the day's growing heat. Rows of clay jars lined the shelves, each sealed and marked. She found herself studying the marks more carefully, feeling how each tiny sign, lotus, papyrus, reed, carried a story no less real than any spoken word. Tia began sorting the bundles of herbs they had gathered in the garden of aromatics. Nefret joined her without needing to be asked. The work felt different now, more solemn, more precious. Each step, from crushing the leaves to warming the oil, seemed part of a single long offering that would never quite end. By midday, the room was rich with the mingled scents of sweet flag, myrrh, and henna. Nefret thought again of the temple, the painted columns, the hush that waited inside the sanctuary. For the first time, she understood that their work was not only for the living. It was a bridge, linking the world of harvests and markets to something more enduring. When evening came, she sat on the threshold, watching the last light settle on the courtyard wall. Her mother came to sit beside her, the two of them quiet in the golden dusk. For a while, neither spoke. The only sound was the rustle of palm fronds overhead, as if the night itself was breathing. At last, Tia placed her hand over Neferet's. "One day," she said, "you will carry the offerings without me." Neferet did not look away from the fading sky. She felt no fear, only a sense that the path ahead was already waiting, as patient and certain as the perfume cooling in its sealed jars. Chapter 5. The Scroll of Recipes. It was near the time of the flooding, when the Nile rose and spread its dark silt over the fields, that Tia decided Neferet was ready to see the scroll. The day had been long and quiet. All morning they had worked side by side, grinding dried petals into powder, mixing small test batches of scented oil to be stored for the coming months. When the heat grew heavy and the last customer had departed, Tia closed the wooden shutters to keep the air cool. Neferet was sweeping the courtyard when her mother emerged from the workroom carrying a lacquered chest. It was smaller than she had expected, no larger than a basket of figs, but she recognized it at once. All her life she had seen it tucked on the highest shelf, wrapped in linen and tied with a loop of braided cord. Tia set the chest down on the low table and sat across from her. "This has been in our family for many generations," she said, her voice as soft as the hush before dawn. "My mother showed it to me when I was near your age, and her mother did the same before that." Neferet laid the broom aside and sat. Her palms rested against her knees, cool despite the warmth in her chest. She had never asked what the chest contained. It had seemed almost forbidden, like the sealed jars that carried offerings into the temples. With slow, deliberate movements, Tia untied the cord and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a fold of linen so fine it looked almost transparent, was a scroll of papyrus the color of old honey. The edges were darkened and brittle. Neferet leaned closer and caught a faint, dry scent, resin, smoke, time itself. Her mother unrolled the top few inches. The hieroglyphs had been inked in steady lines by a careful hand. Tiny pictures of flowers, measuring scales, small amphorae. Even before Tia began to read, Neferet felt she was looking into another world. "This is the oldest record we have of our recipes," Tia said. "Some are so old that we no longer know the names of every plant. Others are still unchanged. Each generation has added a little more, notes in the margins, small drawings to help us remember." Her finger traced one column. "This is the recipe for the kifi you stirred in the cauldron. Here, it says when to harvest each resin, how long to warm it, how many drops of lotus oil to add at the end." Neferet leaned closer. She could see small annotations beside the lines, marks left by her grandmother, perhaps even older ancestors. She thought of all the hands that had held this scroll, the countless mornings spent grinding spices, the evenings sealing jars by lamplight. Tia's voice grew quieter, as though speaking might disturb the fragile papyrus. "I want you to understand, this work is not only mixing and measuring, it is remembering. Each scent carries all who came before. If you forget even one part, something precious is lost." For a long time they sat together, studying the faded lines. Tia read aloud the names of plants Neferet had never seen, flowers that only grew in distant oases, resins carried across deserts by caravans. She spoke of how the recipes had once been copied by temple scribes stored in the great libraries along the river. When Neferet closed her eyes, she could almost imagine those libraries. High shelves stacked with papyrus rolls, the air heavy with the smell of ink and dried reeds. At last,
Tia rolled the scroll again and wrapped it carefully. She did not return it to the high shelf, but set it on the table between them. "One day," she said, "this will be yours to keep." Neferet felt something shift inside her, a quiet certainty she could not have named. Until that moment, she had thought of her learning as something she shared with her mother alone. But now she saw how it stretched backward, past her grandmother, past every ancestor whose names were now only marks in ink. She felt small and proud all at once. The sky outside was darkening to the purple blue of evening. Tia rose and lit a single lamp. The flame flickered over the chest, casting shadows across the table. Neferet thought of how many nights the scroll had waited, resting in its linen wrappings, patient as any living thing. She wondered whether someday her own daughter would kneel here, her hands trembling as she reached to unroll it. When Tia returned, she carried a small dish of dried dates and a cup of sweet beer. They shared the simple meal in silence. Each bite tasted richer somehow, as if the evening itself had been steeped in the knowledge they now held between them. As they cleared the table, Neferet felt no fear of the responsibility waiting ahead. She knew the path would be long, with mistakes and small failures woven among the successes. But she also felt a steady warmth in her chest, the same warmth she had felt the first time she stirred the copper cauldron. Before she went to sleep, she paused by the low shelf where the chest now rested. For a moment, she laid her hand against the smooth, lacquered lid. The thought came to her as clear as the scent of fresh lotus, that nothing worth keeping could ever be learned in haste. And when she lay down on her mat, the night air carried a faint sweetness from the jars cooling on the workroom shelves. She closed her eyes, letting the fragrance fill her thoughts, and drifted into dreams of blossoms and ink, of hands she had never known, but somehow felt beside her, steady and patient in the dark. Chapter 6. The Caravan from Punt. The first time Neferet heard the word Punt, she was still too young to picture it clearly. It sounded like a place from a story, some far-off land beyond the desert where trees bled golden resin and ships brought treasures no one else possessed. But as she grew older, she learned that Punt was real, and its caravans were the reason the perfumery held scents richer than any garden in Wasset. The season of trade came late that year. All summer, the merchants whispered that the roads were slow with sandstorms, that the Nile's floodwaters had risen higher than in decades. But one bright morning, as Neferet sorted fresh myrrh into shallow baskets, she heard a commotion outside. Voices raised, the bray of pack animals, the clatter of wooden wheels against stone. She slipped into the street and saw the caravan arriving. The procession wound along the avenue like a river of color, camels draped in woven blankets, ox carts piled with painted chests, men in long robes carrying bundles wrapped in reeds. A warm wind stirred the air, heavy with the smell of sweat, dust, and something richer she could not yet name. Tia came to stand beside her. She rested a hand on Neferet's shoulder and nodded toward the tallest of the chests. "Punt," she said simply. And in that moment, Neferet understood she was seeing more than a trade expedition. She was watching a link to the oldest perfumes of their craft. The merchants made their camp in the open square behind the temple district. All day the air filled with the cries of haggling, scribes tallying inventories, priests inspecting bolts of linen, spice traders passing small vials of oil from hand to hand. Tia waited until the afternoon shadows stretched long across the paving stones. Only then did she lead Nefret into the square. The merchant who received them was tall and thin, with skin the color of burnished bronze. His necklace of shell beads clicked softly as he moved. When he opened the chest, Nefret felt her breath catch. Inside lay lumps of resin as big as her two fists, amber-colored, translucent, flecked with darker veins like old honey. Even unheated, the myrrh released a fragrance so deep it seemed to fill her chest, warm, bittersweet, alive. Tia inspected each piece with practiced care, turning them in her hands to see whether they held any flaw. She asked the merchant about the journey, how many days across the dunes, whether the resin had been gathered in the cool dawn as tradition required. Nefret only half heard the words. She was lost in the scent, the knowledge that it had traveled farther than she could easily imagine. She thought of the hands that had cut the resin from the trees, the woven baskets that had carried it across the desert, the slow passage by river barge. It humbled her to realize that even a simple jar of oil owed its power to so many unseen lives. After the resin came the smaller packages, bundles of dried frankincense wrapped in palm leaves, a stoppered jar of rare opopanax, pressed cakes of sandalwood powder. Each was precious, but none struck Nefret as deeply as the myrrh. She watched as her mother counted out weighed measures of copper rings to pay for it, her hands steady despite the cost. When their purchases were finished, they thanked the merchant and stepped back into the waning light. Nefret carried the smallest bundle, cradling it as if it might vanish in her arms. All the way home, she thought of how many people had touched this resin, harvesters, traders, boatmen, and how each had given a little of their labor to the fragrance she would soon help transform. The thought made her feel connected to a world far beyond the perfumery walls. That evening, Tia unwrapped the resin and set it on the marble slab in the workroom. By lamplight, the lumps glowed with their own hidden fire.
"Do you remember," Tia asked, "what myrrh does when it is warmed?"
Nefret nodded. "It softens the heart," she said quietly. "It helps sorrow loosen its hold." Her mother's eyes softened. "Yes, and it can ease pain if you know how to mix it." They worked until late in the night, cutting the resin into smaller pieces, sealing the fragments in clay jars to keep them fresh. Nefret felt each movement sink into her bones, the scrape of the bronze knife, the rustle of palm leaves, the faint sweetness that rose when the myrrh was split open. At last, the work was done. Tia extinguished the lamp, and for a moment, darkness settled like a cloth over the room. But even without light, Nefret could smell the myrrh, steady, unchanging, as though the desert itself had left a sign that it could not be forgotten. She lay awake long after she had stretched out on her mat. In her mind, she retraced the path of the caravan, step by step, across dunes and riverbanks, all the way back to the trees whose sap became this resin. And though she had never seen Punt with her own eyes, she felt she carried a small piece of it inside her now, woven into the story of her family, the story of every perfume yet to come. Chapter 7. The Night of Cooling Oils. As the first heat of summer began to soften, there came a night when Tia decided it was time to prepare the cooling oils.
These were the blends meant for the season when the Nile began to recede, when the air grew heavy and dreams turned restless. Nefret had heard her mother speak of them in quiet tones, recipes handed down from the days when queens wore cones of perfumed wax on their wigs to keep their heads cool as the sun rose high. Some were simple infusions of lotus or marjoram. Others took weeks to craft, with layer upon layer of fragrance hidden within a single jar. That afternoon, Tia laid out her tools with more care than usual. The copper cauldron gleamed, polished to a soft glow. The marble slab was swept clean, and the clay jars stood in perfect rows. As the sun fell toward the western horizon, Nefret helped carry the bundles of herbs and the pieces of myrrh they had purchased from the caravan.
"Tonight," her mother said, "you will learn how to blend the oils that calm the heart." Nefret felt her pulse quicken. She knew the recipes by name, but she had never seen them prepared from start to finish. The thought that she would soon be trusted to carry this knowledge made her chest tighten with anticipation. When darkness settled over the courtyard, Tia lit a ring of lamps. Their flames shivered against the walls, throwing long shadows across the workroom. The air filled slowly with the mingled scent of resin, crushed leaves, and warm copper. They began by heating the finest olive oil until it turned clear as river water. Into it, Tia crumbled dried lotus petals, their pale color vanishing as they darkened and released their sweetness. Next came the marjoram, bright and green, and a pinch of powdered sandalwood. Nefret stirred carefully, her hand steady despite the weight of the paddle. She was learning slowly that the motion itself mattered. If she hurried or let her thoughts wander, the blend would cloud or burn. If she moved with the same quiet care her mother showed, the fragrance would remain bright and clean, like a memory held close. When the mixture grew thick and golden, Tia set aside the paddle and unwrapped a small linen sachet. Inside lay a single lump of myrrh, darker and more translucent than any they had yet used. "This is from the oldest tree in Punt," she said softly. "It was gathered by the same caravan that brought us the others, but this is the heart of the cooling oil." Nefret watched as her mother set it gently in the warm liquid. For a moment nothing happened. Then, as the heat softened the resin, a slow spiral of fragrance rose, deep and clear, at once calming and bright. It seemed to fill every corner of the room, to press against her skin with an invisible hand. Tia looked at her over the rim of the cauldron. "This is the scent that quiets grief," she said. "When someone has lost a loved one, they burn this oil by their bedside so the spirit may pass in peace."
Nefret felt a small shiver travel up her spine. She thought of the temples where priests chanted over the dead, the painted tombs where families laid jars of perfumed wax, so that no soul would have to cross the darkness alone. In that moment, she understood that perfume was not only for celebration or luxury, it was a guide, a companion in the hours when nothing else could comfort. They worked until the lamps had burned low. One by one, Tia ladled the finished oil into jars, each sealed with linen and pressed with the family's mark. The final jar was set aside, wrapped in soft cloth to be given to a grieving widow who had come to them weeks before, her eyes hollow from weeping. When all was finished, Nefret helped her mother tidy the workroom. They moved in near silence, as though any loud word might disturb the hush that had settled over the place. At last they stepped into the courtyard, the night air cool on their faces. Nefret looked up at the stars, scattered over the darkness, and felt a strange calm she could not quite name. "Will I know," she asked, "when it is my time to prepare these oils without you?" Tia did not answer right away. She tilted her head back, studying the same stars. When she spoke, her voice was very quiet. "You will know," she said, "because there will be no one else to do it." And when that day comes, you will find your hands already remember. Neferet looked down at her palms, faintly sticky with the last traces of resin. She thought of how many times she had watched, how many nights she had stood at her mother's side without fully understanding. Now, she felt that all those moments were preparing her for something she could not rush toward but would meet in its own hour. They left the workroom behind and slipped through the house to their sleeping mats. As Neferet lay down, she still smelled the cooling oils, rich and clear, like the promise of rest after long sorrow. She thought of the widow who would soon receive the final jar, of how the scent might soften her grief for even a single night. And as sleep came, she felt a quiet pride that she could not have described, a sense that she was becoming part of something too ancient and gentle to ever be fully named.
Chapter 8. The Visit of the Royal Scribe. The morning began like any other. Neferet rose while the courtyard was still cool, washed her face in the basin, and helped her mother set out the tools for the day's work. But before they could begin grinding the last of the sandalwood, footsteps echoed beyond the gate, measured, deliberate, neither hurried nor hesitant. Tia looked up, her hands pausing over the copper cauldron. She exchanged a glance with Neferet that needed no words. Visitors at this hour were uncommon, and those who came with such calm purpose usually bore news of importance. A moment later, the gate swung open. In stepped a tall man clad in linen finer than any Neferet had seen. A slender roll of papyrus was tucked beneath his arm, and a bronze seal hung on a cord around his neck. Though he moved without arrogance, there was a gravity in his presence that made Neferet rise at once to stand beside her mother. "I greet you in the name of the House of Records," he said, inclining his head. His voice was soft, but it carried easily across the courtyard. "I am Senefer, scribe to the steward of the palace." Tia bowed, her hands pressed lightly to her breast. "We welcome you to our perfumery, honored Senefer." He offered a polite smile, then let his gaze pass slowly over the neat rows of jars, the bundles of herbs tied with twine, the low shelves lined with copper tools polished to a soft gleam. "I have come," he said, "to request an inventory of your blends and the sources of your resins. The steward wishes to ensure that each house whose oils are supplied to the palace can show the origin of every ingredient." Neferet felt her heart quicken. They had heard such inspections were being carried out since the last harvest, but she had never imagined a royal scribe would cross their threshold. Tia gestured for the visitor to follow her into the workroom. Neferet trailed behind, feeling as though she were stepping into a story she had only ever heard recited. Inside, Senefer unrolled the papyrus on the marble slab. The symbols were clear and fine, each stroke perfectly measured. He carried a reed pen tucked behind his ear, which he now dipped into a tiny pot of ink. With quiet dignity, he began his questions. "From where do you source your marjoram?" Tia answered without hesitation. "From the gardens near the southern canal. We harvest before the first light touches the leaves." "And your sandalwood?" "It is traded upriver, gathered in the lands beyond Kush." As each question came, Neferet felt the same realization return again and again, that their work, which sometimes seemed no larger than the boundaries of their courtyard, was woven into a far wider world. Each jar held traces of distant places, sun-scorched caravan routes, hidden groves of trees, the hands of gatherers she would never meet. When Senefer paused to make a note, his eyes fell on Neferet. "And you," he said gently, "you are the daughter who will inherit this craft?" She swallowed, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. "Yes," she said in a voice steadier than she expected.
The scribe nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already known. "It is well. I have seen many perfumers' houses, but few as careful in their records as yours. It speaks of a lineage that values remembrance." He turned back to his writing, and Nefret let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. In that moment she felt the weight of the scroll her mother kept, how its careful lines were not only recipes, but proof that they belonged among those who served even the highest households. At last, Sennefer laid down his pen. He examined the rows of jars with an appraising gaze. Then, almost as an afterthought, he gestured to one sealed amphora set apart from the others. "And this?" Tia lifted the amphora's lid and tipped it slightly so the scribe could catch the scent. Even from across the room, Nefret recognized the blend, a delicate mixture of lotus and myrrh, reserved for rituals of blessing. "For temple offerings," her mother explained, "and for those who ask it at the hour of birth." Sennefer inclined his head as though acknowledging an unspoken reverence. He resealed the amphora and stepped back. "The steward will be pleased. You will receive a token of recognition within the month, certifying your oils as suitable for royal use." Tia bowed again, and Nefret did the same. When the scribe finally departed, his papyrus carefully re-rolled. They stood in the courtyard, listening to the last echoes of his footsteps fade into the bright morning. For a long time, neither spoke. The sunlight slanted across the threshold stone. A breeze stirred the drying bundles of herbs, releasing a faint sweetness into the air. At last, Tia looked at her daughter with a softness in her eyes Nefret had rarely seen. "Do you understand now," she said, "why nothing here is ever done in haste?" Nefret nodded slowly. She felt a calm settle over her, something deeper than pride, though pride was surely there. It was the knowledge that every quiet hour they spent grinding and blending had carried them to this day. That no fragrance, however delicate, was ever truly lost when it was prepared with care. Later, as they returned to their work, Nefret found herself lifting each jar as though it weighed more than before, not in burden but in meaning. She thought of the royal scribe's measured words, of the way he had looked at the amphora of temple oil with the same respect she felt. And as evening gathered over the city, she realized she would remember this day as long as she lived. The morning she first understood that their small house was part of something vast and unending, as enduring as the fragrance that lingered in the shadows, long after the scribe was gone. Chapter 9. The Fragrant Cones. In the first days after the scribe's visit, the house felt both unchanged and subtly transformed. The same rows of clay jars lined the shelves, the same bundles of herbs dried in the courtyard. Yet Nefret sensed a new hush in each movement, as though the walls themselves had listened when Sennefer spoke of lineage and remembrance. By midsummer, Tia decided it was time to teach Nefret the art of shaping the perfumed cones. These were among the most delicate of their creations, small pyramids of scented wax pressed and smoothed by hand, worn on the crowns of wigs or hair to melt slowly through the heat of the day. Though simple to the eye, each cone held a careful blend that could soothe or rouse, depending on its purpose. On the morning they began, Nefret helped her mother lay out the shallow copper bowls used to warm the wax. The air was already warm, but the thick walls of the perfumery kept the worst of the heat at bay.
A single clay lamp flickered on the work table, its flame reflected in the polished surface of the cauldron. Tia lifted a jar of tallow and set it near the fire. "We will make 3 types today," she said. "One with lotus and sweet myrrh for festivals, one with marjoram and cinnamon for household celebrations, and one with blue lily and sandalwood for rest." Neferet felt her heart lift. She had seen her mother prepare the cones before, but never been invited to take part. Even as she laid out the linen squares for wrapping the finished shapes, her hands trembled a little with anticipation. The process began with melting the fat until it turned clear and glossy. Into it, Tia sprinkled ground sandalwood, stirring slowly so the fragrance would infuse every drop. Next came the powders, delicate as dust, made from petals dried in the shade for weeks. Neferet watched the pale ripples swirl beneath her mother's paddle, feeling the old wonder she always carried in the workroom. That something so simple could transform into a balm that lingered long after the lamp was snuffed. When the mixture was ready, Tia lifted the paddle and let a thin thread of warm wax drape back into the bowl. "Touch it," she instructed. "Feel how it holds its shape." Neferet reached out, brushing the cooling drop with her fingertip. It was softer than she expected, pliant but ready to firm into something solid. She imagined it smoothing over hair, melting slowly into the scalp, carrying its sweet calm through the longest festival vigil. They began to shape the first cones. Tia measured each portion with a careful hand, never guessing. Neferet did the same, though her first few attempts came out lopsided. She was about to press the misshapen cone back into the bowl when her mother rested a hand over hers. "Leave it," she said gently. "Even imperfection holds fragrance. When you shape the next, you will remember how this one felt." They worked for hours, the light shifting across the courtyard as the sun climbed high and began to fall again. One by one, the cones took form, small pyramids the color of pale amber, each marked with a gentle fingerprint near the base. Neferet found her hands growing steadier as she worked. By the time they began the final batch, her movements had settled into a quiet rhythm. When the last cone was set aside to cool, Tia straightened her back and stretched her arms overhead. Neferet did the same, feeling a pleasant ache in her shoulders. "You will see," her mother said, nodding at the rows of cones. "These are the first things people notice when they come to buy perfume. Not every household can afford oils by the jar, but a cone, they can wear it for a festival or a wedding, and they will remember us when they catch the scent again." Neferet imagined a bride fastening one of their cones among her braids, a child breathing in the fragrance as she drifted to sleep, a mourner finding a moment of comfort in the sweetness that rose from a small melting pyramid. She felt her chest tighten in a way that was not quite sorrow and not quite joy, only a sense of something precious, pressed into shape by patient hands. Before night fell, they carried the cones to the cool storage room. Each was placed in a shallow clay dish and covered with linen. The air inside was rich with mingled scents, lotus, sandalwood, marjoram, and when Neferet closed her eyes, she could almost see the many rooms these fragrances would one day inhabit. As they finished, her mother paused by the doorway. "You will remember this day," she said quietly.
the first time you shaped something meant to pass from your hands into the lives of others. Neferet nodded, unable to find words. She felt the truth of it settle into her heart like a seed. That night, as she lay on her mat, the smell of sandalwood still clung to her hair. In the darkness, she raised her hand and studied the faint residue left on her fingers, wondering how many thousands of times her mother's hands had looked the same. She thought of the scroll, of the long line of names written in ink that was now cracked with age. And as sleep came, she felt the smallest smile touch her mouth, a quiet certainty that even the smallest, simplest shape could carry a world of memory if it was made with care. Neferet rose each morning to the calls of the boatmen, their voices carrying over the water as they pulled their barges between the reeds. It was on one such morning that Tia announced they would walk to the temple of Anubis. Though they had made offerings before the shrines of Hathor and Isis, Neferet had never been inside the precinct dedicated to the god of embalming. The thought made her quiet as she packed their baskets, small jars of resin, cones of sweet myrrh, and a sealed amphora of kaifi. They set out while the air was still cool, the city slowly stirring around them. Neferet studied the narrow streets, the vendors spreading baskets of onions and herbs, the children trailing behind their mothers with sleepy eyes. But the closer they drew to the temple district, the less she noticed the bustle. All her attention turned to the tall pylons that rose ahead, painted with jackals and hieroglyphs. A line of mourners waited near the entrance, bearing woven trays of bread, jars of beer, and small carved figurines. When they stepped aside to let Tia and Neferet pass, Neferet glimpsed their faces, drawn and pale, marked by a grief that seemed to reach beyond words. The priest who greeted them wore a linen robe edged in black and gold. His shaved head gleamed in the morning sun. He did not ask their names. He only inclined his head and led them through the outer court, past rows of pillars shaped like bound reeds. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old incense, something dry and almost bitter. It was not unpleasant, but it made Neferet's heart quicken. She followed Tia past tall statues of Anubis, jackal-headed, hands resting over folded cloths, and felt the same solemn hush she had felt in Hathor's temple, only deeper, as though even her breath must be measured. They paused before a broad altar draped in linen. Here the priest gestured for them to place their offerings. Tia unwrapped the amphora and set it gently at the foot of the largest statue. Neferet placed the jar of resin beside it, careful not to let her hand shake. For a moment there was only silence. Then the priest began a chant in a voice that was neither soft nor loud, but clear as water. Though Neferet could not follow every word, she recognized the names. Anubis, Lord of the sacred land, he who opens the ways, guardian of the silent house. When the chant ended, Tia pressed her palm to the smooth stone. Neferet did the same, feeling the cold seep into her skin. In that stillness, she remembered her mother's words, that fragrance was a bridge between worlds. Here, where the dead were prepared for their long journey, it felt more true than ever. The priest stepped back and studied them with an expression that was not quite curiosity and not quite approval. "You have brought a fine gift," he said. "Few households take such care." Tia inclined her head. "It is our duty to remember." The priest did not answer, but the way he looked at her mother reminded Neferet of the royal scribe. She understood, without needing to be told, that in a place such as this, even the smallest offering was part of something vast, an unbroken chain reaching back through centuries. When they stepped out into the sunlight again,
Nefret felt as though the air itself pressed differently against her skin. She turned to look once more at the towering pylons. For a moment, she thought she glimpsed movement, a flicker of black in the shadows at the base of the carvings, but when she blinked, it was gone. They made their way home in near silence. As they passed the reed cellars, Tia finally spoke. "Someday you will bring offerings without me," she said, "and you will know which fragrance belongs to which hour." Nefret nodded, though she felt too full to speak. She thought of the amphora waiting in the dark hush of the sanctuary, the chant that still echoed in her mind. She knew she would remember the feeling of the cold altar stone long after everything else had faded. That evening she helped her mother grind a fresh batch of marjoram. As she worked, she noticed the quiet in the room, how it felt heavier and sweeter, as if some part of the temple's hush had followed them home. Before she slept, Nefret unwrapped a small cone of lotus wax. She held it in her palms, breathing in the scent that seemed both new and ancient. She thought of all the ways perfume was used, to anoint the living, to soothe the dying, to guide the souls who walked the hidden paths. And as she lay down, she felt the same certainty she had carried from the temple gates, that their work was not only craft, but remembrance, a promise that no one would be left without a final comfort. Summer drifted toward its quiet decline, and the days grew shorter by the faintest measure. Nefret began to wake before the first calls of the boatmen, slipping from her mat to watch the sun gather itself over the river's edge. There was a hush in those dawn hours, a feeling that the city held its breath before the clamor began. It was on such a morning that a traveler arrived at their gate. He wore a traveling cloak stained by weeks of dust, but when he drew it back, Nefret saw that his hair was bound with a single strip of blue cloth, a mark her mother recognized at once. "He is from the lake country," Tia whispered, her tone respectful. "From where the blue lotus blooms." Nefret had never seen the blue lotus herself. All she knew came from her mother's stories, that it grew on wide lakes hidden by reeds, that its scent was richer than any flower in the lower Nile, and that even the smallest jar of its oil cost more than many families earned in a year. The merchant stepped into the courtyard, inclining his head. "I bring the harvest," he said, and Nefret felt her breath catch. She had known they were expecting the shipment, but hearing the words spoken aloud felt momentous, like the start of some rite that required more than skill alone. He laid his burden on the low table. When Tia unwrapped the cloth, Nefret saw neat parcels bound in woven palm. Each was no larger than her hand. Yet the air already carried the first threads of their perfume, light as mist and impossibly sweet. One by one, the merchant opened them. Inside lay small lumps of wax and tiny flasks sealed with clay. Tia examined each with care, her fingertips steady. "This is good," she said at last. "It has traveled well." The merchant bowed. "The blooms were gathered before the midday heat," he explained, "and pressed within the hour." Nefret tried to imagine that hidden lake, the broad green leaves drifting under the sky, the petals opening in the dawn.
She could almost see the gatherers moving among them, hands stained by the sap, their baskets brimming with blue. When the merchant departed, they carried the parcels inside as though they might crumble from a careless touch. For the rest of the day, the workroom was filled with preparation. The copper cauldron was scrubbed to brightness, the storage jars lined in rows. Tia measured the wax by weight, her mouth set in a thoughtful line. "You will help me blend this," she said. "We will begin in the cool hours." Neferet felt her heart flutter. Though she had worked with many fragrances, this was different. The blue lotus was not merely a commodity. It was a symbol, something offered to temples and woven into the crowns of queens. She understood, even without being told, that a single misstep could waste a harvest gathered with great labor. That night, they lit a single lamp and began. Tia set a clay jar over a low flame, slowly melting the wax until it shone like polished amber. Into it, she dripped the first drops of the lotus oil. The scent rose at once, so pure and high, it almost made Neferet's eyes water. "Do you smell how it changes?" her mother asked softly. Neferet nodded. "It's lighter, almost brighter." Tia smiled faintly. "Yes, it carries an edge of something you cannot name. That is why it is prized. No other flower can be mistaken for this." They worked in patient silence, stirring and testing, letting the blend rest before adding more. Sometimes they paused for long minutes, only breathing the air and waiting for the scent to unfold. Neferet found that in those moments, time seemed to loosen its hold. The world narrowed to the soft glow of the lamp and the rising sweetness of the blue lotus. When the blend was ready, they poured it into a wide jar lined with linen. The wax cooled into a flawless surface, pale and smooth. Tia rested her palm lightly on the lid. "This will be saved," she murmured, "for those who can pay its worth, and for the offerings that demand nothing less." Neferet knew she would never forget this night. Long after she lay down to rest, she felt the presence of the flower, some secret note that stayed on her skin like a promise. And as she closed her eyes, she wondered whether every precious thing carried the same paradox, that it could be given freely to the gods, but among humans it cost more than almost anyone could bear. Chapter 12. The Festival of the Rising Nile. In the weeks that followed the blending of the blue lotus, the river began its slow ascent. Each dawn, Neferet walked to the bank to watch the water creeping over the dark silt, the current swirling with bits of reed and driftwood. The rising Nile was both a miracle and a warning. It promised fertile fields and reminded every household that nothing stayed unchanged. When the flood reached the second marker stone, the priests declared the festival of the rising Nile would begin. Even in the perfumery, the excitement was unmistakable. Tia ordered extra amphorae of oil to be set aside for offerings. Neighbors came to inquire after small jars of lotus or sandalwood, gifts to leave at the temple altars. For days, the courtyard echoed with voices, and the workroom never felt truly silent.
Chapter 12. The Festival of the Rising Nile. In the weeks that followed the blending of the blue lotus, the river began its slow ascent. Each dawn, Neferet walked to the bank to watch the water creeping over the dark silt, the current swirling with bits of reed and driftwood. The rising Nile was both a miracle and a warning. It promised fertile fields and reminded every household that nothing stayed unchanged. When the flood reached the second marker stone, the priests declared the festival of the rising Nile would begin. Even in the perfumery, the excitement was unmistakable. Tia ordered extra amphorae of oil to be set aside for offerings. Neighbors came to inquire after small jars of lotus or sandalwood, gifts to leave at the temple altars. For days, the courtyard echoed with voices, and the workroom never fell truly silent. On the morning of the festival, Neferet rose before the first boats set out. She helped her mother prepare the blends they would carry: a jar of marjoram oil, cones of sweet myrrh, and a single measure of the blue lotus wax, wrapped in linen. As she worked, she felt a familiar hush settling over her, a solemn joy she could not have named when she was younger. By mid-morning, the streets had filled with processions. Children danced in circles, their hair threaded with tiny beads. Women carried woven baskets laden with bread, dates, and jars of beer. Scribes trailed behind, recording names and gifts in long rolls of papyrus. Everywhere, the air smelled of crushed mint and incense drifting from portable braziers. Tia and Neferet joined the flow that led toward the Grand Quay, where the high priests gathered to make the first offerings to Hapi, god of the river's bounty. They walked in unhurried silence, careful not to jostle the precious jars in their baskets. Though Neferet had stood on that quay many times before, the sight of it during the festival still made her heart lift. The banners fluttering in the wind, the bright paint of the columns, the hundreds of faces turned toward the water in reverence. At the foot of the broad steps, they paused. Tia pressed the basket into Neferet's arms. "Today, you will give the offering," she said softly. Neferet's throat tightened. She had watched her mother perform this rite since she was little more than a child. Now, she felt the weight of every year that had passed between then and this moment. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. The high priest began to chant, his voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. Neferet climbed the steps one by one, feeling each movement anchor her to something deeper than her own life. She thought of the river that had risen and fallen since before any name was written in their scrolls. She thought of the unseen hands that had tended the flowers and trees, whose scent now filled her basket. When she reached the altar, she set the jars down in a careful row. One by one, she unwrapped them, the marjoram first, then the cones of myrrh, and finally the small linen bundle. As she lifted the blue lotus wax into the sunlight, a hush fell over the nearest watchers. It was the sunlight that had burned the myrrh, and she felt it served to settle a mere minute ago. She felt her breath catch as she saw the way the wax caught the morning light, its surface glistening like a droplet of water about to fall. She bowed her head. "For the blessing of the river," she whispered, the words so soft she was not certain anyone else heard them. But when she turned, the high priest was watching her with an expression she would remember all her life, calm, knowing, as though he saw more in her offering than she herself could. "She understands me now," Kaylin thought, as the woman walked away, her eyes bancy from the work that needed to be done, as though he saw more in her offering than she herself could. "You come with us, and we take you into the priesthood? We're friends? I'm going to meet her in heaven." "You come with us, and we will meet you in heaven." Slowly, she descended the steps. The moment her feet touched the quay, a cheer rose among the crowd, voices layered in praise and relief. Tia stood waiting, her face alight with quiet pride. "You did well," she said. "You did, as all our mothers have done." They returned home along the river road. All day, the city continued to celebrate. Drums echoed across the rooftops, and bright boats drifted along the swelling current. Ah, the drums are still. The boats drifted along the swelling current. Though Neferet smiled when neighbors called out blessings, she felt a deeper stillness within her, something that would not fade when the festival ended. That evening, as they stored the empty baskets and cleaned the last traces of wax from the workroom, Neferet thought again of the way the blue lotus had gleamed in the sun. She thought of the high priest's gaze, of the hundreds of eyes that had watched her place it on the altar, and as she lay down to rest, the festival songs still drifting through the warm night air, she felt she had taken a step she could never reverse, a crossing into a place where her hands carried not just the skill of her craft, but the memory of all who came before her. Chapter 13. The Scroll of Secrets. The weeks after the Festival of the Rising Nile passed in a steady rhythm. By day, Neferet helped her mother prepare blends for the households whose stores had run low during the celebrations. By night, she studied the recipes recorded in their scroll, memorizing every line of ink and the small notes her grandmother had added in the margins. One evening, as the last light faded beyond the courtyard, Tia unrolled the oldest scroll onto the marble slab. Its papyrus was brittle at the edges, and the ink had faded to a brown as pale as dried grass. Neferet had seen her mother consult it many times, but she had never been invited to study it herself. "This," Tia said, smoothing the corners with gentle fingers, "is the Scroll of Secrets." Neferet held her breath. "It records the rarest recipes," Tia continued, "the ones we do not share except with the temples, or those whose need is so great it cannot be refused." Slowly, she traced the first line with her fingertip. "Here is the formula for the oil of night calm, the one they burn beside the beds of the dying. And here," she moved further down, "the preparation for the balm that eases childbirth. Each blend has been passed from mother to daughter, kept safe for the moments when ordinary fragrance is not enough." Neferet swallowed, feeling the hush deepen around them. Tia looked up, her eyes thoughtful. Neferet looked up, her eyes thoughtful. "When I was your age, I believed these recipes were only for the priests and the wealthy. But I learned that grief and fear visit every household, whether or not a family can pay. That is why we keep the scroll, to be ready when someone comes to our gate in the darkest hour." Neferet nodded. She could think of no answer, only the slow awareness that the knowledge written here was as much a burden as a gift. For a time, they read in silence. Neferet followed the lines of symbols, whispering each one under her breath. The words were older than her grandmother, older than the paint on the temple walls. Some were so ancient their meaning could only be guessed. When they reached the final recipe, Tia paused. "This," she said, "is the blend called the Perfume of Renewal." Neferet tilted her head. "I don't know that name." "You would not," her mother replied. "I have never prepared it. Not even my mother did. It is reserved for a single purpose, when a house has lost all it holds dear, when the gods themselves must be petitioned for mercy. Then, and only then, this is burned." Neferet bent over the symbols, trying to imagine what such a blend would smell like. The ingredients were almost impossibly rare, resins gathered far beyond Kush, petals plucked before sunrise on the first day of the new year, powders so costly they could buy a field of barley. "Have you ever seen it used?" she asked softly. Tia shook her head. "No, but it is said that when the smoke rises, it carries a prayer so pure that no spirit can refuse it." They sat together a while longer, the lamp's flame making the ink shimmer and fade. In that quiet, Neferet felt the distance between herself and all the generations who had shaped their craft. She thought of the hands that had pressed these letters into wet papyrus, never knowing who might read them centuries later. At last, Tia rolled the scroll and tied it with a strip of linen. She did not put it back in the storage chest. Instead, she held it out. "Tonight," she said, her voice low, You will keep it by your bed. Neferet felt her heart flutter in her chest. She reached out and took the scroll. Though it weighed almost nothing, her arms trembled. You are old enough, Tia went on, to understand that knowledge is not only for pride or trade. It is a trust. You will keep this safe, and when the day comes that you must open it without me, you will remember how it felt to read it here. Neferet nodded. She pressed the scroll to her breast, as she had seen her mother do. In that moment, she felt something shift inside her, a quiet certainty that she was no longer merely learning. She was becoming the keeper of all that had been entrusted to them. That night, she lay awake long after the lamps had been extinguished. She could smell the faint sweetness of old resin clinging to the linen wrapping. She thought of the perfume of renewal, of the prayers it was meant to carry, and as she drifted toward sleep, she wondered what the gods heard when such a blend was burned. Whether they bent their heads to listen, whether some part of them stirred in compassion for the small, brief lives of those who prepared the offerings. Chapter 14. The Night of Storms. The day began with a hush, more complete than any Neferet could remember. The dawn air held no birdsong, no call from the river. Even the usual voices of the boatmen seemed swallowed by an invisible hand. She felt it the moment she stepped into the courtyard. A charged stillness, as though the world were waiting for something it could not name. Tia was already awake, her face turned toward the river. The sun tinted the sky to the point where she could see no further. Every second, the sun sent an echo of calm to the river. Neferet joined her without speaking. Together, they watched the sky shift from pale blue to a gray so deep it seemed to press against the roofs. A wind rose, carrying the dry sweetness of far-off rain. Today, her mother said quietly, we will keep the doors closed. Storms come swift this time of year. Neferet nodded. She helped her mother move the jars of oil to the back shelves, away from the draft that began to push under the lintel. As they worked, the first drops fell. Soft at first, then so sudden she gasped. Rain lashed the courtyard, churning the dust to mud. The river, swollen by the flood, surged against its banks. Inside, the workroom felt like a sanctuary. They lit a lamp, though it was still morning. In the golden glow, Neferet could almost forget the storm's voice beyond the walls. Almost. It was then, as they sat together wrapping cones of marjoram, that someone began to pound at the gate. Tia and Neferet froze. No visitor would come in such weather unless the need was urgent. Tia set down her work and rose, gesturing for Neferet to stay behind. But Neferet could not remain seated. She followed her mother to the threshold. There, silhouetted by the curtain of rain, stood a woman clutching a small bundle to her breast. Her hair streamed around her face. She looked as though she had run a great distance. "Please," she gasped. "My son, he does not wake." Tia did not hesitate. She drew the woman inside and closed the gate behind her. The rain beat on the wood like thousands of drumming fingers. "Set him here," Tia said, guiding her to a low bench near the lamp. Neferet knelt to see the child, his skin flushed with fever, breath so shallow she could barely see his chest move. In that instant, all the lessons she had learned came to life around her. The recipes in the scroll, the stories her mother told of nights when nothing mattered but the next breath, the next heartbeat. Tia moved with calm purpose. She poured cool water into a basin and set it beside Neferet. "Wipe his face," she instructed. "I will prepare the balm." Neferet dipped the linen cloth and pressed it gently to the boy's brow. His skin was burning, but his eyes did not open. She felt her own heart hammering in her chest. Tia lit the small brazier they kept for such moments. She sprinkled a measure of kaifi onto the coals. Sweet smoke rose, filling the air with a scent older than any she knew. Then her mother unwrapped a parcel Neferet had never seen her open, the small linen bundle that held the ingredients for the balm of waking. It was not the perfume of renewal. That was reserved for loss beyond remedy. But this blend was for the in-between, for the hours when a soul hovered too close to the hidden land. and needed help to remember the way back. The scent came first. Sharp, green, undercut with something almost like honey. Tia worked quickly, blending a paste in a shallow dish. When it was ready, she lifted a small measure on her fingers and rubbed it along the boy's temples, down the column of his throat. For a long time, nothing changed. The storm howled, shaking the doors. Neferet counted the boy's breaths, willing each one not to be the last. Then, so faint she thought she imagined it, he stirred. His lips parted on a shuddering sigh. His eyes flickered, then opened, glazed and confused. Beside her, the boy's mother let out a sob. Tia leaned back, her own shoulders sagging with relief. "He will mend," she said. "Keep him warm. Feed him broth when he wakes again." The woman pressed her forehead to the floor in thanks. Neferet felt tears burning behind her eyes. As the storm roared on, she understood that she had witnessed the heart of their craft. Not only the perfumes that sweetened festival days, but the quiet acts that returned a soul to the world of the living. When the woman had gone, carrying her son wrapped against the rain, Tia sank onto the bench and covered her face. Neferet knelt beside her. Neither spoke. The brazier's embers glowed soft as dawn. At last, Tia lifted her head and met Neferet's gaze. "Do you see now," she said hoarsely, "why we must remember every recipe?" Neferet nodded, unable to speak. She felt the truth of it settle over her like the hush before the storm began. That night, as the rain softened to a steady whisper, Neferet lay awake beside the scroll of secrets. She thought of the balm of waking, of the life it had reclaimed. She thought of all the names she did not know, women who had knelt over small forms, whispering prayers as they worked. And as sleep took her at last, she felt she was no longer only her mother's apprentice. She was part of a chain unbroken by flood, by fire, by time itself. The rains passed at last, leaving the air washed clean and bright. Each morning, Neferet stepped into the courtyard to see new shoots pushing through the damp earth. The river began to sink back within its banks, its broad, slow current carrying away the driftwood and silt the storm had left behind. It felt, she thought, like the world itself had exhaled. One afternoon, when the sun stood high above the palm trees, Tia called her to the workroom. Neferet entered to find the marble table cleared of all but a single jar, a squat vessel sealed with a wax stamp she did not recognize. Her mother rested her palm on the lid. "This is the last lesson," she said softly, "the one my mother gave me when I was your age." Neferet felt a hush settle in her chest. She waited, hands folded, as Tia unsealed the jar. Inside was a thick paste, dark as old honey. The scent that rose was unlike anything Neferet had ever known. It held sweetness, yes, but also something deeper, a note that seemed to speak of things that could not be put into words. "This," Tia said, "is the remembrance blend. It is not for healing or celebration. It is only ever used when the one who made it knows she may soon leave this world." Neferet's breath caught. "Mother." Tia reached across the table and took her hand. "No, child. I am not yet ready for that journey. But you must understand this blend, because someday you will prepare it yourself." She guided Neferet's hand to the jar. "Breathe it in. Let it mark this moment." Neferet closed her eyes. The scent surrounded her, warm and solemn. It felt as if all the stories her mother had ever told, of the first perfumers, of the river's gifts, of the women whose names were written on the scroll, had gathered here, waiting to be remembered. When she opened her eyes again, Tia's expression was calm. "You will keep this," she said. "Not in the storage chest, not in the scroll chest, but in the place where you keep your own treasures. Because it is yours now, as it was once mine." Neferet lifted the jar in both hands. It was heavier than she expected, as though the weight of it came not only from the paste inside, but from all the memories it carried. She set it gently aside and looked up. What happens if it must be used? Tia's gaze was steady. Then you will warm a small measure and breathe its scent, and you will remember who you are and all those who came before you. You will remember that you were never alone in your craft. For a long time, they sat together without speaking. The sunlight shifted across the floor, brightening the pale jars on the shelves. Neferet felt the hush around them deepen until it seemed she could hear her own heartbeat. At last, Tia rose. "Come," she said, "we will walk by the river." They left the workroom and stepped into the afternoon warmth. The river stretched out ahead, its surface rippling with the first stirrings of evening breeze. Neferet matched her mother's stride, listening to the soft slap of water against the quay. When the two had gone far, someone had said to Neferet, "My mother made this beautiful pot with your mother's water." At last Tia rose. "Come," she said, "we will walk by the river." They left the workroom and stepped into the soft slap of water against the quay. They stopped at the foot of the waterfall and stared up at the sun-rippled menagerie. They did not speak of the blend again. Instead, they talked of simpler things. The boats that would come upriver when the harvest began, the baskets they would need to weave before the next flood, the new reeds sprouting among the shallows. But even in that quiet conversation, Neferet felt the shape of something larger, an understanding she could not yet name, but knew she would carry with her all her life. As the sun sank behind the rooftops, they returned home. Neferet set the jar of remembrance blend beside her sleeping mat, where she would see it each morning. She did not open it again. She did not need to. The memory of its scent was as clear as if she held it under her nose. That night, she dreamed of the river, broad and gleaming under a sky filled with countless stars. She dreamed of all the women who had come before her, walking along its banks with jars in their hands and their heads held high. She dreamed she was among them, her footsteps sure and her heart steady. When dawn came, she woke with tears on her cheeks, though she did not feel sorrow. She rose, washed her face, and stepped into the courtyard to greet the new day. And in that moment, with the sky just beginning to pale over the palm fronds, Neferet understood that the greatest gift her mother had given her was not a recipe or a scroll. It was the knowledge that, wherever her life might lead, she would never be separated from the craft that had shaped her, the craft that had shaped them all.